I turned 81 yesterday, and I think in part I began to think about my life growing up, what it was like, childhood, teenage, young 20s, more about that a little bit later. But I think many of us of a certain generation remember two very popular television shows on the CBS television network decades ago. One was the Andy Griffith Show, and immediately following that, years later, was Mayberry R.F.D, Rural Free Delivery. The towns that were portrayed in both of those television shows were actually very similar to the town where I grew up and lived the first 9 years of my life, Minneapolis, in southeastern Iowa, just 15 miles north of Burlington on the Mississippi River. Let's talk a little bit first about my grandparents. My father, Glenn, was the youngest of 9 siblings. His father, Charles, died years before I was born. And I do remember his mother, my grandmother, Mary, briefly, but only as she was a very, very elderly woman. And in the photograph that I posted here, you can see grandmother Mary surrounded by her adult daughters when she was 90 years old. Again, I never knew my grandfather. My grandparents on my father's side lived in Farnhamville in northern Iowa. I know that's a farming community, and I don't know how much time my grandparents lived or spent on a farm, but I do know that at one time my grandfather was sheriff of Farnhamville. My grandmother would have had to be a homemaker simply because when you have 9 children to take care of, even if you have older daughters to help you with the housework and all of those kinds of things, that still is extraordinarily demanding. My father, who was the youngest of 9, and you can see him in 2 photographs here. The first one is when he was probably just barely 1 year old. In a later photograph that was of the Kuhn siblings, my father is on the left side in the front row. On my mother's side, my grandparents were Charles and Lucretia. Everyone referred to her as Lou. I don't really remember my grandfather Charles that much. I have one memory of him, and I have, of course, these 2 photographs. In the one photograph of the family, you can see my mother, Norma. She's in the back row. She was the oldest of 4 siblings. In this other photograph, you can see my grandfather is standing tall, and 3 of his grandchildren are looking up at him. I'm the small boy on the left looking up. I have no idea what the occasion was, but I seem to have been wearing some kind of military cap. In the 1920s, my grandfather Charles was a professor of engineering at what was then Iowa State College, now, of course, Iowa State University. He was hired by the city of Miami, Florida, to go south and become the director of the sewer system. He accepted, and the whole family went down there. Now, Miami was a relatively small community then. My mother graduated from Miami High School, the only high school in Miami, in 1929. That gives you some kind of an idea of how relatively small Miami was then. Nobody but Charles liked Miami. I don't know what the reason was, but eventually everybody moved back, and certainly that was the case after my grandfather died. Back to Minneapolis. It really was like Mayberry R.F.D to me and to my brother. Both of us still have very fond memories of growing up in that community. In the 1940s and at the beginning of the 1950s, there were no more than 800 people living in Minneapolis. With 800 people, we knew everybody. Everybody knew us. I think it also helped that my father was a linotype operator. Glenn worked for the New Era It was a weekly newspaper, and my mother was a homemaker, but she was also very much involved in the church. The first house I can remember was Grandpa Belknap's house. Now, Grandpa Belknap really wasn't our grandfather. We just called him Grandpa Belknap. And he was bedridden. I think the agreement probably was that my father and mother lived with him to kind of take care of him. Later, my grandmother moved to Minneapolis, and she and her sister Emily opened a nursing home just a block from downtown. We moved in with her. And I do remember that there were elderly patients upstairs on the second floor. And it seemed to me that the kitchen was constantly busy with the washing machine, the clothes dryer, all three women, Mom, grandmother, and Emily, all fixing meals and doing all of the chores you needed to do to take care of the elderly nursing home patients. What I remember most about Minneapolis is our ability to run all over town. Nobody worried about children at that age. If any of our neighbors or anybody else in town would spot us, they might call home and say, "Norma, Clint, and Steve are here. Do you want me to send them home? What do you want me to say or do?" And more often than not, Mom would say, "That's all right, just tell them to come home pretty soon because lunch is ready." That's it, talking about Minneapolis or Mayberry R.F.D. this time. More next time.